Welcome to everyone as they're joining. I see the numbers rising, so people are coming into our Zoom room. So as they do, we'll just give it another minute for them to fully log on, and then we will kick off our conversation this morning. Thank you to everyone for joining. Good morning. My name's Nicole Bibbins Sedaca, and I'm the Executive Vice President of Freedom House, and I'm delighted that everyone has joined for this important conversation. Thank you for joining us. This is the launch of our new report entitled Defending Democracy in Exile, Policy Responses to Transnational Repression. For those of you who may not be familiar with Freedom House, we are the oldest international organization in the United States that works to advance freedom and democracy around the world. Since 1941, our work has been at the forefront of supporting defenders of democracy and human rights, and we have been speaking out about threats to freedom for over 8 decades. And today, we see democracy facing another critical test. Russia's unprovoked assault is an attack against the Ukrainian people, as we have all watched so poignantly as this has unfolded. And it is an overt example of a breach of sovereignty. But far away from the battlefields and the headlines, Russia and other autocratic regimes are using a more hidden and a more subtle tool to repress freedom. And that's not showing up on the headlines as much as the Ukrainian assault. These regimes are using violence and intimidation to reach across international borders to silence their critics as they live outside of their country, also in covert breaches of sovereignty. These attacks and threats take many different forms. It's an Iranian journalist in Brooklyn that's stalked by a private investigator hired by Tehran. It's a Saudi activist living abroad receiving death threats on Twitter from the Saudi government trolls. And each case creates a climate of fear that closes the safe space for dissent. And unfortunately, these acts of transnational repression are just getting bolder. A little over a year ago, we saw Belarusian authorities force the landing of a commercial airliner to arrest journalist and activist Roman Pratovich and his companion, Sofia Sepayega. These attacks cannot stand, and there is much that remains to be done. We'll hear more today from our expert panel on steps that governments, international organizations, and technology companies can take. And in just a moment, I'll turn the presentation over to Jesse Bernstein, the Director of Human Rights at the National Security Council, for his insights on how the Biden administration is viewing the challenge of transnational repression. While the challenge is great, our view is that the opportunity to act is even greater. Here, the public sector, the private sector, and civil society all have a key role to play. Smart, coordinated action can create the conditions where the threat is not only met, but the foundations of democracy and free speech are actually strengthened through these efforts. This can be done by governments making transnational repression a national security priority and opening closed doors for vulnerable asylum seekers. By tech companies expanding their protections and developing smart, new company-wide strategies, and by the UN increasing its safeguards to better protect dissidents seeking to engage the international community. And that's just a start of what we all can do. At Freedom House, we will continue to shine a spotlight on the darkest efforts to stifle dissent. As we've seen in Ukraine, autocrats underestimate democracies and the international community at their own risk. We hope that the story in the years ahead will not only be about the spread of violence and intimidation, but also instead about history's latest example of the resilience of democracies to adapt and respond and to defend and expand freedom globally. So with that, let me turn it over to Jesse. Thank you for being here with us, Jesse. Over to you.
Thank you, Nicole, for that warm introduction and for your powerful words. And a huge thank you and congratulations to Freedom House for continuing to shine a light on the global problem of transnational repression. Freedom House's first report on transnational repression helped create an entirely new area of work within and across governments, and this new report clearly builds upon that initial work. We are also grateful for the engagement of the broader NGO community and the continued spotlighting and attention on this issue. As Nicole mentioned, my name is Jesse Bernstein, and I serve as Director for Human Rights on the National Security Council. I will briefly discuss the administration's work to counter transnational repression, highlight some of our actions, and discuss opportunities to work together moving forward. First, President Biden is clear in his commitment to combat rising authoritarianism around the world. Countering transnational repression is one key element of this commitment. To advance progress in this area, we have launched a whole of government effort to prevent and respond to acts targeting activists, journalists, and dissidents beyond their borders. This effort brings together diplomatic, communications, law enforcement, and intelligence tools to deter acts of transnational repression and protect targeted individuals and groups. We are undertaking this work for a variety of reasons. The fact that Americans and individuals residing in the United States are being targeted is unacceptable. Our own communities are at risk. Hence, our first imperative is to strengthen the safety and security of individuals in the United States and to do everything we can to raise the costs for governments who are perpetrating these acts. For example, in March of this year, the Department of Justice undertook law enforcement actions against individuals who targeted dissidents, activists, and even artists from the People's Republic of China who reside in the United States. The PRC-sponsored incidents included interference with an individual's campaign for the US Congress, the destruction of an artist's sculpture, and the harassment of the father of a US Olympic athlete. And the PRC is far from alone in deploying these repressive tactics within our borders. In January, the FBI released information indicating that Rwanda, Iran, and Saudi Arabia have also undertaken acts of transnational repression in the United States. Secondly, there is also a strong human rights imperative to address the growing trend of transnational repression. Repressive acts against individuals, journalists, and dissidents limit their ability to exercise fundamental freedoms of expression and association. But they also send clear messages to entire communities. They dampen activism. In a democracy, and in our democracy, this is a dangerous trend that needs to be confronted head on, not only in the US, but around the world. This is why the National Security Council is supporting federal agencies to comprehensively respond. This work falls into 4 areas. First, agencies are working to hold perpetrators accountable. Various agencies have used their authorities to designate foreign officials and private entities responsible for acts of transnational repression, such as forced deportations. US diplomats are also raising formal diplomatic concerns with perpetrating governments in collaboration with allies and partners. Second, we are building the resilience of targeted communities in the US and around the world, including through agency-hosted listening sessions to better understand needs and develop responses, such as resources to support cultural preservation for diaspora groups. Third, we are engaging international organizations. For example, we are supporting Interpol to undertake reforms to ensure red notices cannot be used by authoritarian regimes to target dissidents. This work is supported by a bipartisan coalition of US members of Congress who worked together last year to pass the Transnational Repression Accountability and Prevention Act, which the president signed in late 2021. Fourth, and finally, we are working with like-minded partners to maximize the impact of our actions. In a globalized world, repressive governments are learning from one another. In the same vein, rule of law abiding democracies need to be consistently sharing best practices. And that's the motivating idea behind President Biden's Summit for Democracy and the motivating idea behind our work in this arena. Looking ahead, I will close by highlighting 3 challenges that we must address together. The first is assessing in real time the scale and scope of the problem. With Russia's further invasion of Ukraine and the dramatic deterioration of political space in Russia, we are now even more concerned about Russian journalists, activists, and political figures fleeing to Europe and beyond. Ensuring their safety as they seek to reestablish themselves and continue their work remains a critical challenge. The second is how to even more meaningfully support diaspora communities here in the US and in other democracies. The needs differ significantly based on national origin, language, and geographic location. A key question remains how to meaningfully support this group, especially by means beyond law enforcement tools. The final challenge relates to proactively responding to digital transnational repression, whereby authoritarian governments use cyber surveillance tools to monitor, surveil, and sometimes censor perceived opponents. Many digital tools do exist, but more work needs to be done to broadly disseminate these tools amongst targeted groups. The new Freedom House report provides a number of important ideas for us to address these challenges. I know many of you in the audience will also have additional ideas, and we look forward to hearing them as well. So thank you again for all of your research in this area. A huge thank you to Freedom House for your leadership. And now back over to Nicole.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I really appreciate those remarks, and I really appreciate you also giving us some very concrete areas that we need to drill down on, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to do that. Before I turn it over to our co-authors, let me also mention to those of you who are listening to the session that we will have a period of Q&A at the end. Would love for you to put your questions in the Q&A function as we go through the discussion, both hearing about the report as well as the panel discussion, because we would love to integrate some of those questions during that Q&A period. So now let me turn it over to our report co-authors who have done monumental work to really bring not only this issue to light, but really drill down on what are those tangible things that we can do to address this very concerning phenomenon. Dr. Yana Gorokhovskaia is our senior research analyst on transnational repression and migration at Freedom House, and Isabel Linzer is our research analyst on transnational repression and migration at Freedom House as well. And so over to you both to share the findings of the report.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Nicole, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Jesse, for that summary and overview of all the important steps that the US government has taken to deal with this issue. It really sets the scene for today's discussion. And I'm very excited to share this report with you today. And I'm also very grateful to our other panelists who are able to join us today, Bradley, Roya, and Max. My name is indeed Yana Gorokhovskaia, and with my colleague Isabel Linzer, I lead work on transnational repression at Freedom House. So transnational repression is a term that we use to describe when governments reach across borders to silence dissent among exiles and diasporas. Its tactics, including assassination, kidnapping, assault, unlawful deportation, detention, coercion of family members, and deployment of software, are used by literally dozens of governments around the world. Transnational repression affects people's lives in small and profound ways by restricting communication with family members, restricting communication with family members, friends, and colleagues, disrupting their professional pursuits, and limiting their ability to travel. As we heard from activists themselves when we were doing this research, each attack really ripples out beyond the individual target, sowing fear and distrust among whole communities. More broadly, transnational repression diminishes respect for human rights, it imperils democratic institutions, and it violates sovereignty. It's both a tool of global authoritarianism and a driver of it. It affects people everywhere, and as Jesse mentioned, including here in the United States and in other democracies. Despite growing awareness of how and why autocrats harm those they view as a threat to their grip on power, most people at risk, human rights defenders, exiled journalists, members of religious and ethnic diasporas, continue to face this threat largely alone. Last year, Freedom House published the first study to examine the scale and scope of transnational repression. Today, we advance the conversation forward by looking at the responses of actors who are able to help targeted individuals. We ask, what can host governments, international organizations, technology companies do to combat transnational repression? The global report we released today is accompanied by 9 country case studies that cover the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Sweden, Germany, Ukraine, Turkey, South Africa, and Thailand. The experience of those countries provides examples of strong and weak policies with regard to transnational repression. In addition to examining policy responses, we've also continued to track how governments seek to silence dissent abroad. And we'll begin today with a brief overview of the trends from 2021.
Thanks, Yana. Can we move to the next slide, please? What we saw clearly in 2021 is that the use of transnational repression is spreading among governments. Freedom House recorded 735 incidents of direct physical transnational repression perpetrated by 36 governments in 84 different host countries between 2014 and 2021. 4 governments, those of Algeria, Belarus, Comoros, and Nigeria, used tactics of transnational repression for the first time in the period we're tracking. Some incredibly brazen acts of transnational repression, such as the forced landing of the passenger jet by Belarus to arrest a journalist, caught the world's attention, but many others did not. In all, we recorded 85 incidents of transnational repression last year. Our database only tracks publicly documented physical cases, which means this is just a small snapshot of the extent of transnational repression globally. Many more cases are undocumented or involve non-physical tactics. Rendition and detention are the most widely used tactics deployed by 30 and 25 governments respectively. Now, this is important to note because detention requires the co-option or cooperation with host country institutions. Renditions also sometimes involve coordination with host state authorities. Increasing cooperation between non-democratic governments was a dominant trend in 2021. Very few acts of transnational repression are truly unilateral. In 74% of the incidents recorded by Freedom House, both the host and origin state were rated not free. Targeting by Minsk and Ankara are exemplary cases of this trend. Belarus took its campaign of political persecution global in 2021. The Belarusian government accounted for an astounding 31% of incidents recorded by Freedom House last year. But the bulk of Belarusian transnational repression went unnoticed, and that's because it took place on the territory of another authoritarian country, Russia. Turkey, meanwhile, has traditionally been a place of refuge for Uyghurs, but this is changing. It's unclear to what extent Turkey is harassing Uyghurs at the specific direction of Beijing, or if it's proactively targeting them as it seeks to expand its partnership with the Chinese government. The bottom line is that perpetrators of transnational repression and their autocratic partners share a set of illiberal values. These governments agree that opposition is unacceptable, and they work to silence dissent wherever it occurs. We're also witnessing that authoritarian cooperation at international organizations, and I'll hand it back to Yana to cover that piece.
Thanks. If we can move to the next slide. At international organizations, democratic and authoritarian governments are competing to promote 2 distinct sets of values. One that forefronts respect for human rights and another that degrades them. Transnational repression is part of that struggle. International organizations, and especially UN working groups, track and document incidents of transnational repression and provide vital information about how governments repress their critics around the world. This is hugely important. Credible, high-profile investigations of specific cases help raise awareness of the problem. They inform civil society work on the issue, give evidence that policymakers can use to inform responses, and impose reputational costs on perpetrators. But documentation, as we found, is ad hoc and limited by a lack of understanding about how different tactics that may result in human rights violations are part of a broader authoritarian strategy. A lack of specific focus on transnational repression hinders accountability. Authoritarian governments are also able to manipulate international organizations to suit their own illiberal goals. Interpol abuse, unfortunately, continues to be a prominent example of this. Of the 36 governments in our data set that have used physical transnational repression, at least 13 have used Interpol in their efforts to reach people abroad. In 2021, we saw that Belarus, Russia, Turkey, Bahrain, and China were able to have people detained in Europe and in Africa using Interpol Red Notices. In some cases, detained individuals were recognized activists on humanitarian visas. They were nevertheless arrested and, unfortunately in some cases, extradited or otherwise returned to the origin state. Idris Hassan, a Uyghur activist who has lived in Turkey for a decade, is currently awaiting deportation from Morocco back to China, despite the fact that the red notice on which he was arrested has been canceled. The abuse and interference of authoritarian governments at international organizations diminishes the universality of human rights standards and makes the world more hospitable to both transnational repression and to authoritarian influence more broadly. International mechanisms of cooperation are not the only vehicles of transnational repression. Digital tools are as well. And I'll turn it back to Isabel now to talk about how we can counter digital transnational repression.
You can move to the next slide. Digital tactics of transnational repression are a global driver of the growth of this phenomenon. They offer governments a low-cost, high-rewards means of harming people abroad using spyware, harassment, surveillance on social media, and maliciously reporting social media posts in order to have them removed. At least 23 governments supplement their physical campaigns of transnational repression with digital harassment, and at least 17 have deployed spyware against people abroad. Digital tactics can sometimes be escalatory steps towards physical attacks, but they are also harmful in their own right, forcing people to change how they communicate with family and friends and professional associates, disrupting their work and activism, and sometimes driving people offline altogether. They can also have severe psychological impacts. Digital hygiene serves as a first line of defense against these attacks, but because of the networked nature of digital communication, a gap in one person's digital hygiene can put entire communities in harm's way. We've heard from people we interviewed just how impactful digital tactics are. Not only are they disturbing and overwhelming in terms of the sheer number, but keeping up with digital hygiene practices and documenting or reporting incidents is incredibly time-consuming. Responses from governments and technology companies can help, but at this point, they're still lagging. As in the case of international organizations, there are existing work streams at technology companies that touch on the issue of transnational repression. For example, attention to harassment policy, foreign influence operations, and cybersecurity are all relevant. But without the awareness of transnational repression and a unified strategy to address it, this pattern of attacks is often overlooked. Private companies are not the only ones who need to think more about their approach to transnational repression. I'll turn it to Yana to discuss government responses.
Thanks, Isabel. Countries everywhere have an obligation to protect the people who live inside their borders from attacks by foreign states. No country has solved the problem of transnational repression, but we can learn from the examples of existing policies in countries where attacks have happened. And according to our research, some best practices involve a high awareness among national security and policymakers and law enforcement of the threat posed by foreign governments to individuals, and this awareness that enables the government to offer effective protection and links that protection to defending democratic freedoms. Providing permanent and full legal status for refugees and asylum seekers helps them find security in their new homes and allows them to access protections. Mechanisms of accountability in the form of sanctions, visa bans, persona non grata designations, and criminal prosecutions are all crucial to countering authoritarian reach. Many governments, however, lack the awareness, the legal tools, and the political will to impose accountability and protect people from harm. Some poor practices that we saw involve law enforcement and security agencies that fail to protect people because they don't understand why foreign governments may pursue individuals living in the country. Restrictive asylum policies and measures to offshore refugee protection trap people in places around the world where they remain within the reach of autocrats. Choosing to forgo measures of accountability for state perpetrators in favor of other foreign policy goals. In some countries, policies addressing transnational repression are conflicting, while in others, like the United States, protections are incomplete. The US government has a very high level of awareness of transnational repression. We've seen this in the current administration in acts of Congress, such as the passage of the Transnational Repression Accountability and Protection Act that Jesse mentioned, and through enforcement by the FBI, which has indicted over a dozen people now for activities related to transnational repression. Despite that significant progress, people in the US continue to face threats from foreign states. During our research, we heard from US citizens and residents about how overwhelmed, afraid, and alone people feel. Even in a secure and democratic country like the United States, where the government is taking very important steps to combat transnational repression, the threat from authoritarian governments remains serious and present. Based on our analysis of government responses, international organizations, and technology companies, we want to end the discussion today with some policy recommendations.
We can move to the next slide. So, what can be done to respond to transnational repression? Governments should build resilience to extraterritorial attacks. They should adopt a definition of transnational repression, track incidents, be able to differentiate between ordinary crime and tactics of transnational repression. They should educate officials who might encounter incidents in their work and have effective ways of reaching out to vulnerable communities. In other words, governments need to have a high level of awareness of transnational repression in order to create good policy. Governments should also work to protect vulnerable people. They should screen incoming diplomats to make sure that the people who make a career out of harassing diaspora are not given accreditation. They should keep track of threats and offer warnings and protection to people when appropriate. They should also recommit to respecting the right to seek asylum. When it comes to imposing accountability, governments have an array of tools they can use, including expelling diplomats, deploying targeted sanctions against perpetrators and enablers, and restricting security assistance to states that engage in transnational repression. And using these measures multilaterally is an excellent way to increase their impact. Finally, governments that want to stop transnational repression should work to uphold liberal values at international organizations like the UN and Interpol. Technology companies can similarly build up their own internal awareness. They can work to lift the burden of digital hygiene and documentation off of targeted individuals. And lastly, civil society organizations have a very important role to play in community outreach, making digital security accessible for all, and offering psychological, immigration, and legal support. I'll stop there. Thank you all so much for listening, and we're really looking forward to digging into this more during the panel. Back to you, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Yana and Isabel. Extraordinary reporting, extraordinarily hard-hitting and chilling, but so important to raise our voice on. I am pleased now to introduce our panel. So we'll join our two co-authors. We'll be joined by Roya Hakakian, who is an author and commenter and has worked on these issues for some time. Also, Bradley Jardine, who is a global fellow at the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. And moderating the panel is international reporter and columnist for the New York Times, Max Fisher. Over to you, Max.
Hey, everyone. Nicole, thanks for setting up this great panel. We've got about 20 minutes to chat, and then we'll take questions. So if you have any, please keep them in mind. Roya, I'd love to start with you. Something that you have highlighted very powerfully in your writing in discussing what happened after you learned of a plot by the Iranian government to target you at your home in Connecticut is the way that transnational repression can end up forcing members of diasporas, even in the US, to live as if they are still living under the authoritarian governments that you maybe thought you'd left behind. Can you talk about how life changed for you after learning of the plot, and maybe about how it has changed for members of the diaspora generally as people become aware of these sorts of plots targeting people in the community?
Thank you, Max, and thank you, Freedom House, for doing this. I'm really moved by the presentations from Yana and other colleagues for especially emphasizing a few really key points, which is that a situation like this can create all sorts of complications, but perhaps one of the most important ones is the way in which that single individual becomes highly isolated. So it wasn't the first time that I became targeted. In fact, I was a fellow at the Wilson Center in 2015 when my computer was hacked. Unfortunately, because we had an IT department, I turned my laptop over and folks there started cleaning up. And then I contacted the FBI. I sat down with them and talked to them about what had happened. So it's been an ongoing situation. And the fact that I just wrote about it last year was in fact to emphasize that, some of these governments are far more disciplined and diligent about the things that we do, as opposed to, democratic governments, because we have to pay attention as democracies to so many other issues, whereas in some ways they're really focused on, among a few other things, eliminating their enemies. So they manage to do it more diligently and more protractedly. One of the things that happened to me, and one of the things that I highlight in the article, is that it was staggering for me to realize that after 25 years, when I was a new immigrant in the United States, one of the first articles I read was by a former ambassador to the UN of the Iranian transitional regime that came to power after the 1979 revolution, the headline of which was, the Iranian government wants to get me, why? And I remember being very young and a new immigrant and thinking to myself, wow, this is 25 years ago, they want to get him. And I remember, the details of the article. And here I was 25 years later, almost writing the very same thing. So I think remembering the intergenerational continuity, the fact that they continue to do this, the fact that they haven't stopped, and the fact that they are doing it in much better ways is and more systematic and actually by informing each other. The Russians are informing Iranians. My website was hacked by a group of Russia-based hackers last week. So they are lending support to each other. And the question is, are we? And I can tell you that, just as the report highlights, this is a very isolating experience. One of the things that I mention in the article is that I was afraid of, people within my own community finding out, because, what happens when you go to the grocery store and people feel that, people are hounding you down and therefore they could come under fire and their lives could come under threat. So I think, I'm going on. So I think one of the things that I would like to see happen is for us to become the launching point of a larger conversation, that they're here, yes, to get, one of us and, this dissident or that dissident. But at the end of the day, it's about democracy. It's about undermining America and American values. And it isn't just about a few dissidents and the fact that they're unsafe in the United States. It's more importantly about making America safe, because we are only the first stop. And they are coming here to get us because we are adhering, supporting, promoting fundamental American values, which has to do with freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and all sorts of other things. So they're here getting us, not because they have a beef just with us individually, but that they have a beef with those fundamental values. And so we are not some foreign dissidents who happen to be in these communities. We are the champions of American values who happen to be writing, in different languages or speaking about these issues in different communities, but we're one of you and we need to be brought in. And our communities need to be informed about who we are and that we are, in a way, a part of you, and we are upholding the very values upon which this democracy stands.
It's a great point about the difficulty of speaking out, but also the importance of doing so. Bradley, I was hoping you could also help illustrate for us a little bit of what this kind of feels like at an individual and human level. Your work investigating China's campaign targeting Uyghurs overseas around the world really underscored, I know for me, something that is of course not unique to China, but that country maybe takes to unusual extremes, which is adopting large-scale methods like surveillance, passport controls, online harassment that are meant to coerce not just individual activists or writers, but many, many people at once. Could you talk, maybe just kind of briefly give us a sense for your impressions, for what you've gotten talking to people in those communities about the effects of those methods on the groups that are targeted and how that kind of changes life for people?
Thanks for that question, Max. And thanks again to Freedom House for inviting me and for the great work that they're doing on transnational repression. As Max mentioned, my work primarily focuses on the Uyghurs, who have quite a unique case, largely due to the scale of the campaign. Of course, since 2017, we've seen mass incarceration within Xinjiang, but this has also had a campaign of repression overseas. My own data sets indicate over 7,000 incidents, from cyber attacks and use of spyware to detentions and renditions around the world. But of course, for the individual impact, I think that Uyghurs face a couple of unique threats in their scale. So for example, many exiles face coercion by proxy, where family members residing in their home country are targeted as a method of placing coercion on activism in liberal states such as the United States. But the Uyghurs, of course, since 2017, there's been a mass incarceration campaign in which 1.5 million or so Uyghurs have been detained in re-education centers. This, of course, means that there's a huge psychological burden on the Uyghur diaspora. Many of them feel very threatened and fearful for their family members. And many Uyghurs have been targeted not because of activism. This is another feature of the Uyghurs are targeted largely because of their ethnicity and cultural grouping. Many of the Uyghurs I spoke with actually became politically active after being targeted by the Chinese state. And many of them became active after their family members were detained, and they felt that the only option available to them was to speak out. So of course, Uyghurs have faced a number of psychological burdens. Many of them have suffered from depression. Many of them are feeling isolated. The large-scale use of surveillance by the Chinese state has, of course, made many fearful. The diaspora communities have become atomized wherever they reside. There's fears of who's an informant within the community, fears of speaking out, and this has really disrupted community life. And many Uyghurs, they can only communicate with their family members using Chinese social media channels such as WeChat. So this places them at risk immediately. It's the only method in which they can contact their family, but it's also a vulnerability for those same family members. So many Uyghurs have faced the very difficult and traumatic decision of cutting contact with their families as the only means of they see as protecting them, which is of course extremely tragic. And due to China's growing political and economic influence around the world, China has a lot more options for exerting pressure on Uyghur communities. And probably the most obvious case at the moment is Turkey, which once had a very vibrant and large Uyghur community of some 50,000. It appears to be increasingly embattled for a number of reasons. I mean, as Yana and Isabel had pointed out, a lot of states have their own incentives to engage in intimidating minority communities to curry favor with countries such as China, which can be large investors or political supporters. So Turkey, of course, has become increasingly marginalized on the world stage, and it's lacking partners, and China's become an increasingly willing investor in the country. And since those developments in 2017, we've seen a lot more threats toward Uyghurs. Some of them have chose to leave Turkey where they once felt safe, but this has led to other problems, such as them being detained in airports in Morocco, such as the case of Idris Hassan. So increasingly, as they leave what was once a safe haven to travel elsewhere, they're also facing a number of restrictions. And this limitation on mobility is a huge problem. Another factor is, of course, that many of these Uyghurs, China's denying basic consular services. It's not allowing them to renew passports. So this threat of expiring passports leaves them within a legal limbo in which they separates families. It creates problems for integrating with society, engaging in the labor force, which is, of course, another huge burden that Uyghurs are currently facing.
Yeah, and it's such an important case study, the difficulties for the Uyghur community in Turkey, a really important warning for what can happen if this goes unchecked for too long. A topic I wanted to raise for you, Isabel and Yana, and then Bradley and Roya, I'll ask your kind of thoughts on it. You've looked a lot at emerging policies and policy ideas from governments trying to counter threats like what Roya and Bradley have described. If I can appeal to your sense of bluntness, is there a single top line lesson that you've learned maybe about what works or what doesn't work, even though maybe it might seem like it would work, in terms of either specific policies or general approaches to this problem?
Yeah, thanks, Max. Maybe I'll just start off. Isabel may have some of her own feelings and thoughts on this. I think that the top line for policies that work, and really that is a through line through security, migration, foreign policy, is awareness. Awareness that this is a threat, awareness of how it affects people, awareness of the methods of the countries that perpetrate transnational repression. That's really the most important first step. And we see in countries, including the US, but also in Sweden and Germany, where governments are actually aware of this issue, of this threat, they can take steps to build resiliency. They can take steps to ensure accountability. You know, we see law enforcement responsiveness. We see actual criminal prosecutions. We see sanctions. And these are all really important measures. And awareness also informs, you know, something we've been talking about is that people may feel isolated when they are attacked in this way. And so awareness helps governments to actually proactively do outreach to communities and make sure that communities that may be targeted by transnational repression understand that they belong in the country where they are living, that they are a part of that country, that they can reach out to authorities, that they don't have to experience this alone, because ultimately the point of transnational repression is to isolate and silence people. And so measures that counteract that are really, really important. I think in terms of the things that are not being done well for countries dealing with transnational repression is really policy trade-offs, right? When we think about wanting to protect people and uphold human rights, but we have other policy considerations, for instance, trade or international partnerships, which may take sometimes priority over those other considerations. So I think in the foreign policy sphere and definitely in the migration sphere, governments need to devote more attention to thinking and prioritizing human rights as a guiding kind of principle.
I'll jump in and add to that. I think so. Awareness, I think step one, I think that the one stepping stone past that is recognizing transnational repression as a unique threat to democracy. Yeah. This happens at many levels. On the individual level, people who are targeted with transnational repression may not be able to participate in civic life in the way that they would want to. And that, of course, is the foundation for democracy. That inhibits people at the individual level. At the kind of government level, transnational repression is a direct violation of sovereignty. This is most clear, of course, in physical attacks, but as we've discussed, these non-physical attacks are escalatory, are still violating the rights of people in these foreign countries, whether or not an agent from the targeting state is actually on the ground during them. And then this is also kind of at a much more macro level. Transnational repression is the physical manifestation of what we talk about as global authoritarianism. This is the world that is created when governments are able to impose their illiberal norms and do so without facing repercussions. So I think, you know, we hit at all of these different levels, and it's just so important for governments to recognize and kind of combat that at each of them. You can't take transnational repression piecemeal, and that's why we think it's so important for governments to take these broader approaches that, as Jesse said, kind of a whole of government approach. And on the kind of the negative side of of what we're seeing, the flip side of recognizing it as a unique threat to democracy, is that transnational repression should be kept as a distinct issue from things like counterterrorism. We see it often lumped in together with counterterrorism or other kinds of foreign influence activities, but that actually does a disservice to efforts to counter transnational repression. If you think about counterterror activities, that really kind of securitizes individuals and looks at individuals as a threat to state security. Whereas the case in transnational repression is those individuals are actually the people who are being targeted. They are at risk from a foreign state, and it kind of muddies the waters. And I think that's why really the awareness of transnational repression as its own issue is incredibly crucial.
Bradley, you work with a pretty wide cross-section of countries. Anything you'd add that Isabel and Yana didn't touch on as kind of broad lessons and what works, it doesn't?
Sure. Yeah, I think one area that they highlighted initially is digital threats. I mean, especially from all my surveying among the Uyghur diaspora community, it's clear that a large number of them employ digital hygiene methods. They're very well informed about what they should do individually to protect themselves, but they're less aware of channels where they can report cases of harassment, and they're less aware of who they should be reaching out to and what their rights are. This just shows the burden at the moment in terms of awareness among government agencies as well, because a lot of the burden is currently on activists themselves to protect themselves, and there should be more support for them, because that's a huge emotional burden. A lot of these digital security methods are very time consuming. They're very strenuous to add on to individuals' lives. So of course, things such as the FBI has been releasing public bulletins lately, which have been raising awareness of threats that Uyghurs and others have been facing. So I think more awareness like that is great, including the information page on their website highlighting threats. But it would be great in general to have broader regulations on what's allowed in terms of cyber and espionage, because at the moment individuals are not protected from espionage, only government figures and so on. So a lot of individuals themselves, they have no basic protections in place. And civil society as well faces a lot of struggle from digital threats. I mean, speaking with the World Uyghur Congress, I learned how much of their already small budget has to be allocated now to cybersecurity. So for authoritarian regimes like China, it's a low cost but high yield strategy from silencing individuals. So I think a lot more work needs to be done for this, because it is eroding a lot of important international organizations.
We've got about 2 minutes left. Roya, is there anything that you've learned experiencing some American policy responses to transnational repression firsthand, and approaches in dealing with individuals that you found to be either helpful or not particularly helpful?
Well, I think I deeply appreciate the work that everybody's doing, both at the National Security Council and then, NGOs like Freedom House. But I think there is a major piece missing. And I think, in the past 4 or 5 months, listening to President Zelensky, in some ways, I am constantly reminded of some of our own predicament. He keeps saying in every speech that Ukraine is fighting the fight of democracy on the world's behalf. And I think one of the points that need to be made and somehow really driven into the minds of everybody around is that dissidents who primarily come under fire by these other governments, no matter where they are also doing the same thing. They're also fighting the fight for democracy on an individual level. So we are not some strange people from a bunch of strange countries speaking these strange languages in American communities. Rather, we are the paragons. We are the people who are upholding the best of the American values, and propagating them through our own means. And I think that kind of changes our image, who we are, and how people need to take, in some ways, ownership of us within their own communities, within their own societies, to not just connect us with one another across the countries, but also connect us from our own communities to the broader American community. And that's, I think, what's really missing. So we're not asking you, to supply weapons to us, because that's not the kind of war we're fighting. But I think the fundamental principle stays in place, which is we are fighting for everybody, and therefore everybody needs to be supporting us.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Excellent. Max, thank you so much for your moderating of that discussion. I think we could continue it at least for 3 or 4 more hours and still probably just scratch the surface on the complexity and depth of this issue. But I do want to bring in a few of the great questions that we're seeing popping up in the Q&A box. Let me start with this one specifically about Interpol. And maybe I'll look to Yana and Isabel maybe to start us off. If you could speak to ways in which the Interpol red notice system might be reformed or changed in some way to avoid being used as a tool in transnational repression.
It's a great question. As we've talked about at length today, Interpol is an important way that governments do reach their nationals abroad. And there's a lot that host countries can do to stop that. Starting, I think, with voice and vote at the institution itself. Perpetrators of transnational repression are in leadership positions at Interpol itself. And especially by working together with like-minded governments, democracies can push back on that and help limit opportunities for abuse. And also on that, a lot of these countries, we control the purse strings of Interpol. The US government has a huge portion of funding to Interpol, so do many other democratic partners. And that's another area to look at, really taking kind of serious action to say that this is not acceptable. So that's what we can kind of do at Interpol. I think then domestically, there's plenty host governments can do at home as well to build resilience and insulate the abuse, because we certainly can't expect it to stop overnight, despite all of the good efforts that are underway. So one thing to think about here is how Interpol notices are used by law enforcement in a given host state. It's very important to recognize that they don't go through the kinds of due process standards that we might want to see in our own countries. And so clear guidance and codification that Interpol red notices should not be used as a basis for arrest, extradition, would be very important to help protect people, and are things that can be done with some speed, hopefully, to protect people. And then finally, I think a lot of host states can do more to call out Interpol abuse. Transparency and reputational costs are also an important piece of this puzzle. I'm actually looking forward to later this month, as a result of the TRAP Act, which we talked about earlier, the Transnational Repression, Accountability, and Prevention Act. The US government, the DOJ, and state are required to produce a report that outlines Interpol abuse by other governments. And that's a really important opportunity to make sure that all of the governments who are engaging in that behavior are on the list, are flagged as known perpetrators, can be tracked for future abuse, are on the list to consider further actions against them. And I think there are more opportunities for the US and for other governments to take similar action.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Isabel. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to throw out a question and just ask all 4 of our panelists to comment specifically on where we have seen authoritarian governments have an impact on international organizations, right? Because international organizations are supposed to be a platform for a wide variety of voices, including civil society, and yet we're seeing dissidents and political opponents silenced in those fora as well. And so maybe if I could just have us go around to everybody to comment on where are we seeing that, and what are opportunities do we have to ensure that international organizations or regional organizations are not used to advance transnational repression. Bradley, maybe I'll start with you and then we'll go around the circle.
Sure. Thank you for the question. Yeah, international organizations have been particularly targeted by a number of countries, but especially by China, especially at the UN level. Of course, the UN already has monitoring abilities and policies in place to ensure that people who speak out on human rights as fora receive protections, but there's less well-established and codified understanding of transnational repression and some of the unique threats. Other aspects of the asylum procedures. So speaking with Uyghurs in Pakistan, for example, I found that many of them claimed that they'd been denied services by the UN HCR. Local governments were monitoring them outside the facilities, and many of them became fearful of even applying through those channels. So that's an example to pay more attention to on the ground, wherever communities are residing, of certain restrictions that they're facing.
Excellent. Thank you, Bradley. Roya, have you seen this phenomenon, and what, from your perspective, should we be thinking about from an international organization's standpoint?
Well, I'm not sure if I would be answering your exact question, but I think one of the most disturbing phenomenon that I observed came in 2017, 2016, 2017, after the rise of President Trump to power. And, a lot of the programs that we're bringing, organizations that we're bringing persecuted refugees and minorities out of, say, Iran, had to shut down because, shut down their operations in Europe and elsewhere, because Iran had come under the Muslim ban. And the fact that these people were, LGBTQ community members, or, Baha'is, or Jews, or persecuted Christians, it didn't matter. That somehow that blanket ban didn't distinguish among these smaller groups, among these persecuted groups. In other words, the minorities within the minorities. And so that was probably one of the most terrifying events that I have ever observed in all the years that I've been in the United States, that somehow even we can abandon these minorities who have done everything in their power to leave Iran, come to Europe, thinking that they're now safe, but then some blanket decision sends them back to the very place that they ran away from. And that's, I think, whatever safeguard we can somehow put in place in order to make sure that even in light of such major decisions, we still continue to distinguish the rights of these smaller communities would be really key, because several refugee organizations had to completely shut down their operations and send people who had sold everything, basically done everything they could to cross the border and come to the other side, to go back to the very place they'd run away from. And I think these are the sort of things that cannot happen again.
Thank you for that, Roya. A really great and important point to make. Yana, in our last minute, I'm going to give you 30 seconds of that last minute for any other comments, particularly on this international organization level, but really anything. There's so many things that we didn't get to touch on, but anything else you want to just throw into the conversation before we wrap up?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Can everyone hear me? I think I had some sound. Okay, great. So I think that this question of international organizations is part of this broader discussion about the impact of global authoritarianism, right? What autocrats have understood is that norms and rules are up for debate, right? They are not settled in the way that we may have thought about them being settled, that democracy is the preferred system, that we all respect human rights. These are actually things that are being contested right now, whether that's at international organizations, whether that's through Interpol, through asylum policies, through funding, civil society. These are all areas of contestation. And so democracies need to kind of come together to advance their own version of what the world should look like, and one that is based on respect for human rights. And I think if we do that and we're able to act together in multilateral ways, then we can not only sort of counter transnational repression, this specific tool of authoritarianism, but also authoritarianism more broadly. And I think that for us, Freedom House's program of countering authoritarianism, of which transnational repression is a part of, really speaks to that aim. And we hope, Isabel and I hope, that this project contributes to that conversation.
Excellent. That's such an important point to end on, Yana, because we are talking about individual humans and individual countries, and we're talking about a systemic problem, and we've got to be able to talk about both of them, and it's so important. And so your comments really just tie all of those pieces together, because we do have to focus on the individuals who are putting their lives at risk by speaking up for the very rights that so many of us enjoy every day. But we have to see this as part of a much, much larger trend that is going on how authoritarians are undermining the norms, undermining democracies around the world, and really seeking to stretch their repression far beyond their borders. There are so many questions that we didn't get to, both in the Q&A, and I'm sure in all of our minds as well. I will say that we are going to be continuing the conversation on Twitter Spaces later in the month, so please do keep an eye out for that invitation. Let me wrap us up by saying huge thanks to Yana and Isabel for tremendous work in pulling together this report that is going to be impactful moving forward and really advancing the thinking. Thank you very much to Jesse Bernstein for his comments and for what the administration is doing. Thank you to Max for moderating our conversation, both with our co-authors as well as Roya and Bradley, who added so much to this discussion just to really bring home the reality of what this phenomenon means. So thank you to everyone. Thank you for those who attended. Great to be in conversation with you, and we look forward. There's a lot of work to be done, and we look forward to doing that with each of you. Thank you.